Hey, I'm Chef Tom with All Things Barbecue, and today we're preparing competition-style St. Louis cut spare ribs. We're using a rack of Duroc St. Louis cut spare ribs from our friends over at Creekstone Farms. We'll be seasoning the ribs with a 50-50 mixture of Our Butts Are Smokin' Ozark Heat and Butt Kickin' Chicken rubs. We'll also need some brown sugar and some honey, and we'll be saucing with a mixture of Plowboys en Fuego, Firebug Mild, and Texas Rib Candy Apple Habanero. As we start the trimming process, what we want to do is try and get this thing into as perfect a rectangle as possible. What we'll do is insert the knife at the top of the longest bone and make a straight long cut parallel to the bottom of the ribs. At the end of the rack with the smaller bones, you'll probably want to take that last bone off. The meat kind of trails off from there and it's hard to make it even otherwise. At the end with the larger bones, you'll want to watch out. You can see here we've got a bone that's been cut in half. We'll go ahead and completely remove that. You'll also want to look right here where you see that this white part meets the red part. There's typically a little meat flap hanging here, and we'll trim that down so that it's even with the rest of the surface. Next, we're going to remove this film that's on the back side of the bones. Start at the corner down where the larger bones are, and with a paper towel, rub away at that corner until that film starts to pull back a little bit. You'll be able to get your thumb under there, and then hopefully pull it off in one big piece. Sometimes they want to tear, so just go back and make sure that you get any of that off of there. It's important to remove this because that tissue really won't let any smoke or any flavor through. So when we go to rub these, none of that would get to the meat, and it would have a hard time taking on the smoke there. Obviously, our end goal is to get as much flavor into these ribs as possible. Now we'll just examine all surfaces of the ribs. If we see some excess fat on the front side, it's a good idea to take that down. If there's anything that seems out of place or keeps the rack from looking uniform, you'll want to remove it. Let's move on to seasoning. As I mentioned before, we're using the Our Butts Are Smoking, Butt Kickin' Chicken, and Ozark Heat, a mixture. But before we get there, we want to put a little binder on the outside of this meat to make sure our rub really sticks. We'll be using yellow mustard, but if you want, you could use oil or something like that. The mustard's sole purpose is to bind the rub to the meat. The mustard flavor itself will be unnoticeable in the finished product. Once all surfaces are covered in that thin film of mustard, it's time to apply the rub. You'll want to apply a moderate amount of rub to the ribs. Use too little rub and you miss out on a crucial opportunity to add flavor to the ribs. But if you use too much, you could create a layer so thick that it's hard for the smoke to penetrate. Obviously, we need a balance of those two things, so like I said, a moderate amount of rub. With all surfaces seasoned, we'll let the ribs sit and soak up some of that rub. You'll notice in about 5 to 10 minutes that the color has darkened and you'll see spots where moisture is coming through the rub. This lets you know that the rub is attached to the meat. We cook our competition ribs on a Yoder Smokers YS640 pellet cooker set to 275 degrees with a 50-50 mixture of cherry and pecan pellets from Barbecuer's Delight. We'll place the ribs directly on the grate, bone side down, to protect from any radiant heat, and smoke them until they reach a rich mahogany color. This stage usually takes 2 to 3 hours, but don't get too attached to timelines. It's very important that you're more in touch with the meat than you are with the clock. When you've reached the mahogany color, remove the ribs from the cooker and lay out 2 sheets of foil, big enough to wrap the ribs in. The ribs will cook wrapped in foil for the remainder of the cooking time, but before we return the ribs to the cooker, we want to take the opportunity to add some more flavor. We'll do this by first laying down a layer of brown sugar on the foil, as well as some honey. Now place the ribs on the foil, meat side down. Now a little more brown sugar and a little more honey. Season the bone side of the ribs with some of the Our Butts Are Smoking rub mixture. This will allow us to add a little more spice in the place where the judge's tongue first hits the rib. Double wrap the ribs in the foil tightly, being careful not to puncture the foil. If the foil is not wrapped tight, there will be room to create steam, which will negatively affect the bark you've already created. Place the ribs back on the cooker, meat side down this time. What will happen from here on out is the sugars will melt and combine with the liquids released from the ribs. And this liquid is going to baste the ribs as they cook, breaking down the tissues and making the ribs tender. I begin to look for doneness after an hour of the ribs cooking in the foil. What we are looking for is meat that is bite-through tender, supple in texture, but does not fall right off the bone. There's a fine line between perfectly cooked for competition and fall off the bone overdoneness, so you have to be careful here. The first thing I'll do to check for doneness is just pick up the entire foil package. It should have some movement to it. If it's still completely rigid, I know that they haven't softened up enough. Another way to check for doneness is to remove them from the foil and set them on a cutting board. Lift from underneath in the center, and the ends should stay on the board, and the middle, the meat's gonna wanna break over. Now that we know our ribs are cooked to the proper doneness, it's time to sauce them. We're using a sauce comprised of equal parts Plowboy's Barbecue and Fuego, Firebug Mild Grillin' Sauce, and Apple Habanero Texas Rib Candy. Each of these sauces has a specific purpose. The Plowboy's Barbecue and Fuego has a nice tomatoey base with a little bit of heat. The Firebug Mild Grillin' Sauce adds a fruitiness, and the Texas Rib Candy adds sweetness and sheen, as well as a little more heat. We're using a brush to sauce both sides of the ribs while they're hot off the grill. This sauce is thin enough that we don't have to worry about brush strokes on the surface of the ribs. And it also allows us to touch up the sauce after we've finished slicing the ribs. After adding a light coating of the sauce, tint the foil around the ribs and allow them to set up for about 10 more minutes. Next, we'll remove the ribs from the foil and place them meat side down on the cutting board. Slicing the ribs meat side down allows us to see exactly where to make our cuts. And like I said before, if we mess up the sauce on that top side, we can still touch it up when we're done slicing. Slice the ribs as straight and evenly as possible. Now this is where it comes in handy to cook multiple racks of ribs for the one box that you're going to be turning in a competition. Sometimes you're going to come across defects in butchering or shiners where the bone becomes exposed during the cooking process. Being that it's so difficult to control these variables, it's best to have way more ribs than you need when you go to select your 6 most evenly sized, best looking ribs to put in your box. Again, the main things to keep in mind throughout the cooking process, the meat dictates the cook, not the clock. Being flexible is every bit as important as knowing and executing the basic steps involved in the cooking process. You essentially have one look and one bite to impress the judges. Take every opportunity you can to make the flavor and presentation the best you possibly can. Thanks so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed the video, please click subscribe. And if you've got any questions or comments or there's anything you'd like to see me cook, let me know in the comment section down below. For more recipes, tips, and techniques, you can head to thesauce.atbbq.com. All things barbecue, where barbecue legends are made.